interview with RKL folks. I think most of you have completed those interviews, so thank you for taking the time to do so. Lauren or Adley, who would like to kick this off?
I would love to. Thank you, Director Catlin.
Lauren.
All right, I'm actually going to share my screen. Bear with me here. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Jack. Okay. All right. So as Jack so well put, we will be providing an update on the GM CEO total compensation study and 360 assessment. Just as a quick summary from last time, my name is Lauren Stricker. I am a senior analyst with RKL Virtual Management Solutions, and I'm joined here today by my colleague, Adley Sadazin. He's an analyst with the Workforce Strategies team at RKL Virtual Management Solutions, and we are the main point of contacts for RTD through this project, as well as Stephanie Smith, who could not be here today. During today's presentation, we will give a progress update on the total compensation study. We will also give a progress update on the performance assessment tool and kind of reset expectations as far as the addition to the project plan and change in timeline. We'll start with the total compensation review. This slide itself should look very familiar to the last meeting. It is a recap of the scope of work for the total compensation review, and that has not changed since our last conversation. So just to reiterate, the scope of work here is to conduct an external market competitiveness assessment. And we'll do this through a custom survey that we have distributed, and I will be providing you an update on that. And it covers both base compensation as well as other aspects to include a total compensation package for the GM and other GM or chief executive officers of comparators that we have identified during our last conversation. In addition, we'll also be conducting an internal equity assessment and completing this analysis and report by August 31st and presenting the report to this group on September 9th. As before, we have provided a detailed project plan and timeline that has been enclosed in the committee packet for your review and reference. Now on to some progress report and any updates from last time. There was some changes to the comparator list from our last discussion. First, we did add 4 additional private comparators, which I've listed below there in the bright orange box. These were recommendations from GM Johnson, which we vetted. Unfortunately, we weren't able to look at the same metrics that we did for the comparators, as that's not available to us or accessible to us. However, we did look at the types of transportation services offered, the diversity of those services, as well as the revenue, and felt that they were fair competitors to add to the list. In addition, we removed 2 public comparators, Smart and Hart. Those were removed again by recommendation of GM Johnson due to the smaller fleet size, bus fleet size, as well as the lack of diversity of transit mode services offered by those 2 organizations. Any questions there? Now, I do want to point out that these metrics have been updated as of 1 p.m. today, your time, which is why they look a bit different. What was provided to you was as of Tuesday morning. So we have received some changes or responses since then, which is very exciting. And we'll give you the most updated metrics right now. So as you see there, the survey, the total compensation or total reward survey was distributed to comparators early the week of the 29th. So the 29th and the 30th. They were distributed via email and phone, depending on if we had appropriate email address to access or a phone number that we could try and get a contact through. From there, we received several responses in the first week and early on this week as well. One of the responses did request or require that we complete a public record request in order to get the information, which we did, and they have provided us with that information that we have requested. Additionally, we received 6 other confirmations from other 6 comparators with the intention of completing the survey. However, we have not received their survey responses yet. We intend to reach out to them Monday to follow up with their intentions to ensure that they can get that completed before the 16th. We do have 6 completed survey responses so far. That does include the organization that provided us information in response to the public record request. Any questions there? Okay. As we wait for the responses to come in, we'll move forward with the internal equity assessment. There are pieces of the total compensation survey that we're hoping to also inform from a benchmarking standpoint, the internal equity assessment. But that's what we can work on in the meantime while we're waiting on responses. After the responses have been submitted to the 16th, we'll close the survey, start analyzing the data, and compare that to GM Johnson's current package and offerings. That would be what will be included in the report that we'll be presenting to you September 9th. There's no further questions on the total compensation survey. I'll move on to the 360. All right. This slide should look somewhat familiar from the last conversation that we had, with some slight changes to it. I will start this conversation by saying I think that the conversation that we had last time was very helpful to us to understand the expectations of the performance committee, the questions that you had, the concerns that you had, and I appreciate you sharing those during the last conversation, as well as your continuing to share those during the one-on-one interviews that we had the fortune to hold with each of you. I think to best summarize the discussion, if I could, from the last time, I think there was some confusion, or maybe better stated, discrepancies and expectations around this assessment, including coming from our team as well. And as Jack had summarized, Jack and Charlene brought to our attention some language in the contract to help clarify the scope. And as such, we have adjusted the project plan to propose to you today, as well as the timeline. Just as before, we're still on track to create a custom 360 assessment, distribute that to raters, and collect data, collect their feedback, and provide that report summarizing their feedback to GM Johnson and this performance committee, as well as the board. That has not changed. What has changed is the inclusion of a performance assessment tool that would be utilized by the board. The concept of this tool would be to evaluate the same components that's evaluated in the 360. However, the board themselves would be completing this tool or this evaluation form to assess those components. The relationship between the 360 and the performance assessment tool in our recommendation would be an informational relationship. What I mean by this is that the performance committee would receive the results of the 360 prior to completing the board evaluation or the performance assessment tool.
I might stop here. Are there any directors that would like to comment on this? Lauren, I think you captured it pretty well, that there was some confusion as to whether there would be, the tool would be used as a prescriptive tool, and I believe we have concluded that it will really just serve to inform. Is that correct? I see a nod.
I think that was my understanding. I mean, I know that was my understanding. I would very much be open to any other feedback from other directors if they have a difference of opinion.
Are there any other directors who have thoughts about this before we move on? Director Geisinger?
No, I think that's a good use of this tool. I know that in our previous meeting, Lauren, I think you advised us that this is typically not a good performance tool. It's a good developmental tool. And that if people are treating it as a performance tool, they tend to rank people higher. So I think given that information and that just making it an informative piece is really good. You said that the performance assessment tool for the board would have the same questions as the 360. Will we, as a committee, have an opportunity to comment on those questions?
Just to clarify, the board assessment tool would not have it would not be the same exact assessment as a 360. For example, I think internal relationships is a good example here, where in the 360, we can really dive into that probably at a greater detail because we're getting feedback from those who are likely best to be able to inform the direct reports. So questions related to internal relationships on the board assessment tool would probably be higher level. And likely that's where the 360 feedback would be most helpful to the board in those areas where you don't have the direct observational ability as those closest and work closest with GM on regular basis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess same question though. If will we get a draft performance assessment tool that people can comment on, or what's the plan there?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you for repeating your question. Yes. So we would propose a list of questions to the performance committee to comment on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments from committee members? Are there any from non-committee members? Okay, go ahead, Lauren.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Catlin. As in this development or this addition or clarification, I should say, of our project, we did note that the timeline or recommended the timeline be adjusted to allow us to really complete the performance assessment tool, and not necessarily complete it, but distribute it, collect the board's responses, and turn around a report in a reasonable time after you have received the 360, because the intention is that the board would be able to use the 360 to inform their evaluations, especially in areas where they don't have that much oversight in or insight in, I should say. So we'll be discussing the timeline in the later slide, and Jack will jump in on that. The timeline related to the 360, however, that we discussed during our previous conversation has not changed. So the dates of the deliverables, so the report due to the performance committee has not changed. It's just an expansion at the end to accommodate the performance assessment. As before, we have provided a detailed project plan and timeline that has been enclosed in the committee packet for you to take a look at. I think that it seems like we're all on the same page, but just to reiterate, the concept here is that the board would receive the 360 assessment tool as well as GM Johnson's self-evaluation, and they would complete their own evaluation. Those items would feed into or inform, I should say, the board's evaluation. The process or approach that we had discussed during our last conversation remains largely unchanged in relation to creating the 360. We have had excellent interviews with the performance committee members, all performance committee members. We actually just had our last one today. So I feel like we've gotten some really great information. However, we do intend to send out a survey to the broader board to collect similar information at a less detailed level, basically to understand what they are hoping to be evaluated as part of the 360, and for them to identify some of the major concepts that we heard through the interviews as what they would see as most important versus less important. As I've mentioned before, while we want the 360 360 to be as comprehensive as possible. GM Johnson has a lot of duties on her plate, as I'm sure she's aware and as you're aware. And so it's important that we evaluate the very critical aspects of the job responsibilities, as well as her goals and the values of the organization, and that we do this in a way that is respectful of all raters' time. So that does mean that we can't create, an extremely long survey. So we have to be very smart about what we are evaluating. And that's the purpose of the interviews, as well as the survey that we'll be sending out to the board, to really identify what is the most important things. Is any questions in that part? Okay. We have reviewed the GM's job description, reviewed the organizational values. I do have set up an interview with you, GM Johnson, to discuss your goals and expectations as well. I look forward to that conversation. I think it's the week of the 20th. We'll use this information to develop questions based on the components that have been the most important components that have been identified through the interviews, through the board survey, in conversation with Charlene, as well as GM Johnson. Those questions would be submitted to the performance committee for comment prior to distribution to raters. On to the conversation of raters. We are recommending the following guidelines be followed in the selection of the raters. We're hoping to include about 5 direct reports, and just to back up, raters in this case would mean those who are invited to participate and provide feedback through the 360 assessment. And typically, raters of a 360 are direct reports, supervisors, peers. Because of because of who we're evaluating, GM, peers in this case are likely more going to be external stakeholders. So we're recommending that we solicit feedback from 5 direct reports, 3 board of directors, and 4 peers, like I said, in this case, external stakeholders.
Do any directors have thoughts on that number of 12? More or less?
I'm sorry, I'm on my phone, but I'm raising my hand.
Director Guzman.
I do apologize. I think that overall identifying these raters would be fine. I would like to find out when it comes to the 4 peers stakeholders, how, what that looks like. Are we inviting recommendations from General Manager CEO Johnson, and then having the opportunity to look at that and see if we're missing any particular feedback that we'd like to receive from persons throughout the district before we decide on them, or we making that decision? How is that going to work?
Director Guzman, I think that's a really astute question. Thank you for asking it. We recommend that GM Johnson provide us with an initial list of who she would recommend that we solicit feedback in these separate buckets. So direct report, board of directors, peer, and stakeholders. This then would be submitted to the performance committee for comment. We recommend this because GM Johnson knows best who she interacts with on a daily basis and who could provide the best feedback related to how she's performing in her job responsibilities, her goals, and the values of the organization.
Does that answer your question, Director Guzman? I think we may have some more discussion about this as we move forward. And I do see that GM CEO Johnson's hand is raised. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Ms. Stricker. I'm seeking clarification. At the last meeting in which you presented, whereby you were offering up comments about best practices relative to how many raters, it was stated that typically it should be 8 to 10. And now I see 12. I'm just trying to understand the genesis of that. Thank you very kindly.
Great question. Thank you for asking, GM Johnson. The recommendations that I have here are based on some of qualitative or feedback that we received through interviews as far as who from a stakeholder standpoint should be included, or, you know, the quantity of options that are available to us. And I would say that's also in the same thought process used to inform the direct reports as well, of just from a quantitative standpoint, what percentage from the direct report could we receive feedback from that could represent your direct report pool. From a board of directors standpoint, I think it's important that we hear feedback from them. However, I don't feel it is as important to receive a vast majority of feedback from the board of directors, as the board of directors is completing their own final assessment and separate assessment in this process.
Does that answer your question, GM CEO Johnson?
Yes, somewhat, but I can reserve my questions for my interview. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other comments? Director Geisinger, please. You're on mute.
Thank you, Chair Catlin. We had talked about a different approach where GMCEO Johnson was appointing some and we were doing some together, and some of that. Where are we on that?
I think, sorry.
Lauren, what I heard you say, and we can certainly discuss this further, but I heard you say that initially GMCEO Johnson would propose these raters, and that the committee then would have an opportunity to review and provide comment and perhaps other suggestions. And I know that among the directors that I talked to, that there would be more of a self-selection process of which directors would, based on input from Ms. Johnson, but which directors would be considered raters. And then I know at some point we had talked about GMCEO Johnson proposing some external stakeholders and the board providing suggestions for external stakeholders. And I think what's being proposed right now is slightly different in that GMCEO Johnson would first propose some, and then we would have an opportunity as directors to take a look at that and propose, agree to or propose alternatives. Did I capture that all right, Lauren?
Yes, I agree with your summary, Director Catlin. I think that I'm hopeful that we would arrive at a similar result in the end.
Director Geisinger, does that answer your question, or would you like to dialogue about that some more?
What do you mean self-select of the board? You mean the board would pick, or we would wait for people to say, I want to do it, or what does that mean?
What I meant by that, and I see that GMCEO Johnson has her hand raised. What I meant by that was that GMCEO Johnson would recommend those directors she would like to have review it, but then we would dialogue amongst directors to find to either agree or provide alternatives to that recommendation. GMCEO Johnson? Okay.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to put out here for everybody's consideration. For all intents and purposes, I'm confident in my ability to lead the organization. I don't need to self-select. You guys can choose randomly. As it relates to direct reports, I engage with a myriad of different people that report directly to me. I'm thinking we could draw straws. So as it relates to who's doing what, I think we're trying to get a sense of my interactions and how I'm showing up relative to the values or the ideals and beliefs that I hold to be true, and how am I going about doing that. I do have a question relative to the parent stakeholders as it relates to the board. Totally amenable to the board opining, but really, I believe it's incumbent upon me to provide some kind of understanding, because how many of you know who I deal with on a day-to-day basis? And the realm of my participation, not just in coordinating with those that may be within the city and county of Denver or the greater metropolitan area, but my work as relates to transportation as a whole. So I believe those need to be considered as well as we talk about what might be optimal. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Director Geisinger?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Is the goals people that are dealing with the GMCO on a day-to-day basis? We got a lot of opinions out there in the peer stakeholder world. I have some, I'm trying to figure out with a 360, are we just judging the CEO, or are we also, looking at the agency, which to me, they're so intertwined. So I think that I like the idea. I'm fine, with our GM CEO suggesting peer stakeholders. I think the board, I guess I was concerned with the statement that we would comment. It seems to me like it ought to be more that we could add. And maybe it's getting big, or that we both come up with lists or something like that and work it out together.
Thank you. Jim, CEO Johnson, would you like to respond before I call on Director Guzman?
Yeah, just a point of clarity in reference to words matter. This is a 360 review, and I don't know how many board members have been the subject of 360 review, but I wouldn't say it's to judge me. It's to assess my abilities and how I show up. It's not about judging. Thank you.
Okay, Director Guzman.
So thank you. That answers my question fully that I asked earlier. And I quite agree with the general manager. This is an assessment, not a judging. However, my question about the peers and stakeholders was really to figure out if we're getting a good realm of understanding, because this is going to inform potentially the conversations we have going forward. And so, to the general manager's point, I'm not trying to block you out of this at all. I'm actually trying to invite you into it, but just understanding how this process is going to work. So thank you. I appreciate that conversation, and I think that we are in the right spot. We can probably continue with the presentation if it's possible.
Thank you, Director Guzman. To summarize, before we move on, so GM CEO Johnson will identify her, like she says, it would be like drawing straws, and she would pick her 5 direct reports. The board of directors will similarly select 3 directors who would, this is an effort that we all take seriously, and so we want to make sure that those directors are fully engaged in this exercise. So we will decide on the directors that will participate with the input from GM CEO Johnson. And then from the peers and stakeholders perspective, it seems like that we will get an initial proposal from GM CEO Johnson. The board may have, after looking at that, if we decide that looks good, we can move on. Otherwise, if we wanted to suggest some alternatives or some changes or some expansion, we would have an opportunity to do that. Am I capturing that all right, Lauren?
That seems like a fair summary if that is acceptable to the performance committee.
What I would like to see, especially with the external stakeholders, when Ms. Johnson provides us with her suggested raters, is that she maybe take a moment to provide the rationale for selecting that person or for suggesting that person. And that might move the process along a little faster, because as she said, she knows who she deals with on a daily basis, and maybe we as directors weren't aware of that ongoing dialogue or ongoing engagement. And so to provide that explanation might be helpful. Is that something you could do, Ms. Johnson?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Yes, most definitely. That was my intent. So you guys could garner a better understanding of, the relationship and the coordination. So thank you for stating that.
That would be great. Any other directors? Are we okay with that approach? I don't see any other hands raised, so we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Catlin. Next here, we're going to discuss the change to the timeline. I'm actually going to invite Jack to summarize or expand here on the timeline adjustments from his perspective. Jack, it looks like you're on mute.
Sorry, everybody. Thank you, Lauren. And again, Jack Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office. I just want to draw everyone's attention. We have several TBDs towards the bottom of this list. That's pretty standard. The work plan that you all have seen for the Performance Committee, indicates, and even the schedule that we went over last time you all met indicated we still had some TBDs. As we get to this time of year, we often encounter holiday travel and other items that we have to account for. And so the board office will be in close coordination with GM and CEO Johnson to get her availability. And then based off of that, we can begin to pin down some dates towards the end of the assessment cycle. As a reminder, you all are obligated to complete and approve a final assessment score no later than December 31st every year under the employment agreement. And so you'll see dates here listed as TBD in the middle to back half of November. And so we would most likely wrap things up with the Performance Committee's work towards the end of November. And then what we have done the previous 2 years is there's been a special board meeting called in the early part of December to issue a final assessment score and make that a publicly available item. One thing that did change from your timeline that I pointed out last time you all met that should make managing the end of the year process easier this go around is that you all have kicked out, not kicked out as in removed, but you've just simply extended your runway to the beginning of January to finalize the GM and CEO's goals and performance assessment framework for the subsequent year. In previous evaluation cycles, you were confronted with the task of completing the assessment for the current year and establishing the goals for the subsequent year at the same time, which made things very challenging and untenable and often muddied some of the conversations. And so we think by separating these two and giving you all a little bit more time to get through all of that, you will end up with better results as such. So that's all I wanted to add on the timeline here.
Thank you. And I'd like to point out that the more detailed timeline is presented on packet page 7.
Director
Okay.
Catlin, if I could just add a few more items here on the timeline.
Please.
But just to note that the November 11th, this is when the Performance Committee, I believe, scheduled for that day, is when we would present the 360 assessment results. And following that, we would distribute the board assessment. And that's how the two would overlap in that way.
GM CEO Johnson, I see your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps I missed this, but when there was an orientation to this table that's listed before us on the slide, I didn't hear any reference. What does the NS mean? I see dates, but then I see RKL, which is, of course, the consultant, but what does NS represent?
Director Catlin, if I could respond to that question. Thank you, GM Johnson. I apologize. I should have put a key on this slide. It is a snippet of the detailed project plan that we submitted as part of the packet. NS is defined in the key in the packet, but is not on this slide, and it just means not started. The key has not started, in progress, or completed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, Lauren, please proceed.
We actually have reached the end of our presentation today on the progress of the total compensation survey and the 360 assessment and total performance assessment. Any additional questions at this time?
Are there any directors who have questions? Thank you very much, Ms. Stricker, for your presentation. I think you got all the input that you needed from us. So, moving on, our second item is for the agency key performance indicators. And for this item, I think Committee Vice Chair Geisinger and I would like to lead this presentation and discussion. But is there anything I would actually like to start out by saying we have talked about this starting early on in the year, and there was an understanding, at least from committee members, directors, and board members, that we would have what we were referring to as key performance indicators identified by the September timeframe. And so this initial discussion item and board report was really intended to get that ball rolling and get that started so that we could have a good dialogue and complete our work for September so that we could move forward. And one of the things, and Director Geisinger, feel free to jump in, or even Board Executive Manager Kroll. What we really want is a starting point in what I see and what others see to be a multi-step process. We need to get started on identifying some of the performance indicators, and we have committed for quite some time now to provide a clear forward-facing dashboard. And I'm reminded, and rightly so, that we contain, or we have a lot of these data in various forms, whether it be in a board report, whether it be on the dashboard. There are a number of areas where the staff is collecting these data, but what I personally would like to see is a single repository for all of these data and these performance indicators, so that to the public and to our other stakeholders, they see how we're doing as an agency, what trends there are, and how we're moving forward. And then just as we move forward. I don't know if Lynn, you have anything to add to that? I was a little bit convoluted, but I know that Chair Davidson has also given this some thought. So both of you, I would encourage your feedback and input at this time.
Just a couple things. I think you summarized it well. You know, our focus right now is working with the committee and the board and Ms. Johnson to identify the data that we want, and some of what we put in here is to pull it out by mode and to give some context. What was this like a year ago, or compared to our budget, or those sorts of things, so people can understand it. I think that it's a next step. That not all of these will have targets or KPIs, and we'll be looking to staff to set those on some of them. Hopefully this does not add too much work, because I think some of it is, as you said, Peggy, in the board briefing documents or other places. And I do think that bringing it to the board, perhaps in the monthly packet, and putting it on the dashboard, or just sending the board to the dashboard if it's updated, will make a big difference. It's something a lot of people have been looking for a while. So I agree with all you said. Thanks.
Thank you, Vice Chair Geisinger. Chair Davidson, comments?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with the characterization, and what I would say is, I think we started a conversation once we adopted a new performance evaluation framework, and that framework being included two objective measures. This was when we were looking at the general manager and CEO performance framework, but also the agency performance framework. There was the red box, which were annual goals. And then there was the yellow box, which was the agency metrics. And I think what we're trying to accomplish here is you kind of breaking this down into first things first. We got here by addressing the fact that we believed that the Net Promoter Score driven success outcomes in our strategic plan were lagging indicators, and that the lag or the tail on that was especially long. And therefore, we wanted to identify metrics that we can track and perhaps then set goals around at the agency level that lead and show us, might indicate to us what would move our success outcomes from an earlier vantage point. So I think there are future things we might do, like set goals, future things we might do, like establish frameworks for agency evaluation based on those metrics. But I think the first things first mentality is right now the board and this committee just needs to identify what are the metrics that we want to be more regularly looking at as a performance committee that give us month over month or year over year, depending on the metric, visibility to things that we hypothesize might indicate movements on our success outcomes a little bit earlier. So I think we can keep this pretty simple and determine what are the data that we simply want to put on the board, the scores that we want to be tracking. And then we can, once we've identified that in collaboration with staff, we can then be identifying where are there opportunities to set goals in the future. But I think right now we're just starting from identifying those metrics. So thank you. That's the perspective that I have to share.
Thank you, Chair Davidson. I would like to add that the memo that the agenda item that accompanied this board or this packet was just a first step, and it's draft with in capital letters as far as I'm concerned. And I was remiss in my communication with the GM CEO in that she had very little time to respond with her comments about that. She took the time and very thoughtfully did reply with some good comments, which I appreciate. I think moving forward, I commit to having a more ongoing dialogue about this, but we just wanted to get something started. And so please, I encourage directors to take a look at this and see what you might like to see added, what does not make sense to see moving forward along the lines of the strategy that Chair Davidson outlined, what you might like to see. And please, as we move forward, we have a little over a month to I won't say finalize, but to get this in order to present to the board for our September goal of getting some KPIs identified and getting a forward-facing dashboard that is useful for the board, for staff, and for our stakeholders and the public to see. So I would encourage, not necessarily at this meeting, but moving forward, any comments, additions, suggested subtractions that you might have regarding this rough draft. Thank you. Ms. Johnson, please.
Yeah, thank you very kindly. So while we indicate this is draft, I would be remiss if I didn't state that there are some presumptuous statements that are included in this document that I don't support. But more specifically, I think we have to be intentional as we talk about key performance indicators. That term is used very broadly, and I don't know how many individuals on this call actually understand the notion behind a quantitative indicator relative to ensuring that there is progress toward an outcome that can be assessed. And so if anything more specifically, as I look through the document, as we talk about metrics, for instance, there are certain elements that are outlined that aren't necessarily tracking something. And so as we go forward, it would be of great interest to me and members of my team as we spent 5 hours just earlier today, really honing in on the difference between a leading and lagging indicator and discerning what key drivers have come from various inputs that we've received relative to employee satisfaction surveys, in addition to community value and customer excellence surveys, in which we had made great strides. But as we go down this road, recognizing that we do have a myriad of different data, and we are amenable to showcasing that. But really, I need to garner a better understanding relative to where we are, and would appreciate engaging on that front sooner rather than later, so we can manage the expectations. If the intent is merely to showcase to the vast populace that we are doing various things for the sake of doing things, I'd like to be more intentional and purposeful. So once again, I would appreciate the opportunity to engage early and actually hone in on what we're trying to solve for. Thank you for your consideration.
And thank you also for your earlier input. And there are some items in this draft. For example, we've asked for a report. That's a report, not necessarily a KPI, but one of the things that we're really desiring, I think, are these data to really inform some of our decisions going forward. Anything else, Director Geisinger? I mean, it's really.
Yeah, just I guess it would help if there's certain of these. I wasn't exactly sure, Deborah. Are there specific ones of these that you're concerned about? In terms of the data we're asking, great. I say let's meet again and make sure this works for you and the staff. I'm just trying to understand where we are.
Ms. Johnson, and then I saw Director Davidson's hand go up.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
No, there were certain elements I didn't understand what you guys were driving at. There's some kind of terminology that's used, and it's my understanding that some of this information could have been captured looking at different agencies. And so I don't understand what we mean by excess wait time, because that's not something we generally utilize. Are we talking about schedule adherence? So I'm just saying that as I read it, and those are the questions I presented. And so I do believe, Director Geisinger, you do have my track changes that weren't incorporated in that explains the vantage point from which I was coming. I just need clarity, you know, as it relates to some of the terminology, retention versus attrition. That's really what we're trying to look at. And then when we talk about key positions, every position that we have at the agency is critically important as we deliver service. And there were just some that were qualified. And as we look at where we are, we have interdependencies, and I often share with the team that we're very analogous to a jigsaw puzzle. No matter the shape or size, if there's one piece of the puzzle that's missing, that box top cover won't be realized. So I'm not one to want to pick and choose what positions, but we need to qualify it in such a way, because while you have MOW in rail, there's still light rail, there's still commuter rail, but then again, you have individuals that are maintainers on the rubber tire side, which is critically important, because that facet of our organization are the ones that are really more flexible and agile in providing connectivity when there is a disruption in service. So I just didn't understand some of the terminology and the genesis for it. So I am totally amenable to the data. Want everybody to be clear about that, because we have a myriad of it and in support of it. But I think we need to have alignment in what we're trying to showcase and what the purpose is, and to educate and inform those that aren't familiar with what it is, because what it is a drive towards. And so as we talk about OTP, I'm certain that several of you may not know the differences as relates to on-time performance contingent upon mode, and we don't have fixed guideways. So when we look at data that we may be extrapolating from MARTA that is in a subterranean aerial configuration, we actually have street running light rail consists that stop at traffic signals. So that's what I was trying to understand. So thank you very much for allowing me to expound.
Thank you. I'm going to reply, and then
Okay, go ahead.
and then I believe Director Geisinger has a follow-up to that, and then I'll call on Director Davidson. But I think what we're really aiming toward is capturing data and having it so that we can answer questions when they are posed. But also, I think that we have found ourselves responding to data that others are filling in for us that may or may not be correct. And we want to make sure that we are driving the narrative from an agency perspective rather than having others try and fill in perceived blanks. So, and I don't think we have those blanks, but I think we just would like to have those data. Director Geisinger?
Yeah, just to say thanks that I think that explanation that you gave, Ms. Johnson, is helpful. Excess wait times, I see why that's probably not a measurable thing, for instance. And I think, we're totally open to hearing how we do that differently. And sitting down and talking it through makes a lot of difference. Just one other thought that had occurred to me after, we put some ideas together here too, is the dashboard is also, as a public facing document, it's a good opportunity, for instance, in the environmental sustainability to, and this may be APTA data or something, I'm kind of making this up, but to be able to say, if we move 65 million people a year, or however, wherever we're at, I think that's not too far off. What does that mean in terms of cars off the road, or some VMT? I don't know what we can show like that, but to show how important our transit services are, I think is another way to look at this. But yeah, let's continue the conversation. I think that's it's exciting to get some of this out to us and to the public.
Thank you. Chair Davidson, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I thought I would just jump into and highlight a few areas that I had jotted down as being helpful. And again, from my vantage point, this is all about saying, to me, the success outcomes as we defined in our strategic plan are very long lagging. And so what are the things that, I believe could help get some earlier insight? And so I'll state some things just for feedback from the board report, and certainly would be curious to hear feedback from you, Madam Chair, committee members, as well as General Manager and CEO Johnson on all of what I have to share. So on the strategic priority of financial success, that we take seriously the management of our resources, in terms of getting a sense of where we are going and whether there will be perception of that and whether there will be spending less than we take in. The two that I had written down that are on this list are budget variability, watching that over time. Again, not setting a goal at this stage, but just putting the things on the board that would be helpful to look at the year-over-year analysis and trend, which is looking at that variability. I always find that very helpful in the board report because it gives some idea of, where we're going, and we're making a lot of changes in that area. Likewise, the cost per revenue hour and understanding where that is. I would be very cautious in putting goals on something like that right now, because I think that there are plenty of ways we could decide to move one particular number like that we may not want to do. But looking at those costs per revenue hours by mode and understanding the overall trends, I think are helpful from a long-term vantage point. In terms of the community value, which has a lot to do with providing value to customers, and I think leans heavily into our vision of becoming a trusted leader in mobility. I think the one thing that's written here is the percentage of our progress towards the comprehensive operational analysis, I think is helpful, given that that's our plan of record. I think I've long had this question of what's the best way to do that. And I would look to our general manager and CEO for recommendations as to whether that's total revenue hours that we're delivering versus what's in plan. I don't know what the numerator or denominator would be, but percentage towards the board approved operational plan would be helpful. Partnership dollars is something that our partnership program is something that I saw on here, but one of the things I'm interested in, given the relatively limited resources of the agency in terms of having state funding or city and municipal funding, is that the amount of dollars that we unlock, in other words, how far we're stretching our dollars through matching programs in the partnership program. So I noted that there's something in there about the dollars we put forward, but I think I'm more interested in the data of, what have we unlocked by putting our dollars forward from a partnership vantage point, which I think demonstrates the community's trust to some extent. From a customer excellence vantage point, I have a hard time pointing to anything but on-time performance, just given perhaps my own experiences and what, we all hear folks talk about at the bus stop. I just would be interested to watch that over time. Again, hesitant to establish goals until really understanding what that data look like, what those data look like. And then I think, the employee ownership, there's a lot of interesting things we've started to get a better view of under Chief People Officer Pileggi's leadership with some of our more recent surveys. And there's probably some things we could look to for inspiration. I don't have specific notes at this time. So in summary, budget variability, cost per revenue hour, some way of measuring our percentage versus our comprehensive operational analysis or our plan, and our partnership dollars unlocked and our on-time performance are things that I would certainly benefit from more frequently looking at in a very focused way on a month over month or year over year, as the case may be. So I thought I'd offer that as feedback to the board report. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I'm assuming you have it documented and can forward those points to us, and we will make some adjustments for a second bite at this apple. As a time check, it's 3:01 and Dr. Guzman told me that he needed to leave as he was called into work early. Is there anything you would like to say before I call onto Director Sloan?
I thank you for the opportunity, and I do apologize to everybody, but work is work. I would like to just say with these KPIs, there are certain categories that we do need to look at. A lot of this information we know is publicly available, but I do think we need to be careful about how we categorize it. I apologize for the background noise because I am at work. And how it's being used, but I do agree with what Chair Davidson said in terms of basic things. Look at it from the street, right? Any person standing at a bus stop or a train station is going to want to know a couple of things. Anybody that's asked to invest in the public transportation system through their sales and use tax collected, they're going to want to know that we're taking care of things. Are we delivering service? Are we doing it as appropriate as possible, on time and reliably? And the difference between safety and security as a word in my head, I'm still struggling with, but we know our system is safe. And we know that we are working to secure individuals, but that is a deeper question. And so how we relate some of those ideas as a category down into measurable, distinct pieces is truly important. So to the general managers, previous comment, we need to be very careful about the language that we use and the intention behind whatever we use for KPIs, which, key performance indicators, and how we're assessing that, because some of the things that we might look at will be well outside of our control. If an individual steps off a bus, they're no longer on RTD property necessarily, right? And so what does that mean when it comes down to safety or security? Well, was the bus ride safe because the mechanics did their job and the operator performed well? Yes, they were safe. But they get onto a public sidewalk or a public right-of-way, that's not our purview. It extends beyond our area of responsibility. And although we don't not care about what's happening, where do we end and other things begin, and how can we fairly assess that? So I do want to also be careful with one other thing before I leave the call, which is I would like to know personally what the economic impact RTD is bringing to the entire region. And that can be assessed a bunch of different ways. But I also want to be very careful about some of the quote unquote return on investment stuff, because I think that just gets us into trouble in some ways, because we all pay sales and use tax into a system for the whole, not into a system for locality. And we are not a local transportation agency. The name of the agency in the Constitution of our state is the Regional Transportation District. And although we represent smaller sub-districts within the entire region, it is truly unbelievable anybody would have an expectation that we would be able to enumerate, calculate, or otherwise identify how much of my money that I've given in sales and use tax am I getting back as an individual, whether I choose to utilize the system or not. I am, in part, subsidizing through my tax payment to the district service for everybody, whether they need a wheelchair accessible vehicle, or they need a lift to get to work through one of the live programs that we offer, whether it's somebody who is an elderly person who needs more specialized attention and care, or if it's just a regular, 18-year-old who I voted for to ride free on this system continuing forward. And so I think that there are a bunch of ways to look at these things, but we as a board of directors have an onus and responsibility to be very precise and very careful with the language that we use so it is clearly understood what we are looking at and why. And maybe we need to start with taking a step back from our balcony and go down to the dance floor and figure out what people on the ground are looking at, which we all know, and then come back up and say, okay, from this balcony view, we're looking at these things for these reasons. I hope that makes sense. And it's noisy, so I'm going to cut out.
Thank you. And I'll get back to your comment about return on investment in a minute, but I'd first like to call on Director Sloan.
Thank you, Chair Catlin. First, as a general matter, I would like to say the formatting of the KPIs in terms of the strategic priorities is brilliant and the way to go. I think it shows consistency on RTD's part and reasonable expectations of employees, the board, and the public in general. So I really like that division of the KPIs. As far as the proposed KPIs go, I think they're definitely in the right direction. I appreciate CEO Johnson's comments because obviously she is in the best position to word these correctly. And, that will be valuable. It needs to be soon because this committee has deadlines that come up and it needs to be done. So, I really appreciate the committees digging in and getting these done. And of course, the CEO has the best way to look at these. I would also caution that they're probably the right number of KPIs given. There are so many things that can be measured that some folks in the public would be interested in, but it has to be brief enough so that it's digestible by anybody who looks at it, whether it's the board or the public. And finally, I know this is not the time to get into particulars, but I would just like to point out one thing in the customer excellence KPIs, and surely there's a better way to express that. But I think for customers, dropped runs are critical, and I know that is not calculated into the on-time performance metric. I think that would be a good addition. Finally, security-related incidents. Again, there's got to be a better way to narrow that down to see what it is we do want to measure in terms of security on our buses and light rails for our passengers and particularly for our operators. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Sloan. I really appreciate that. And I would encourage other directors to provide input into the draft KPIs, and we'll have another go at this in short order. So I appreciate all your input. Director Guzman did talk about something that I wanted to bring up, and Director Tisdale is not here, but he had brought it up as well. And that is the fact that his committee that he chairs, the Finance and Planning Committee, had on their work plan a discussion of this, quote, return on investment. And in speaking with Mr. Kroll, and he's done some work. APTA has started looking at, rather than a return on investment that is a, what am I getting for the dollars I'm putting in? Rather a more comprehensive look at what the transit does for the economic health of the region and the what's the economic impact of transit overall in the district. And so if this committee were to amend its work plan, I would suggest, and certainly open for discussion, that we include a economic impact evaluation as opposed to a return on investment evaluation. I see GM CEO Johnson has her hand raised. Are there any other directors that have thoughts about that? Ms. Johnson?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. This just amplifies the importance of us getting together because my team and I have already explored this and have meetings relative to engaging on developing an economic impact statement that is a benefit for us relative to a local, state, and federal impact. And so there's been several discussions and we're moving that ball forward, recognizing that we need to provide a whole view as opposed to something segmented. And so I'm happy to engage with you all once again so we can be aligned. Thanks.
Perfect. And thank you for that. And I am aware that some of your staff are working on that, but it just in terms of the work of this committee, Director Tisdale was highlighting or pointing out the fact that we had not yet amended this committee's work plan to reflect such an exercise. So with input from you and your team, Ms. Johnson, we will slot that in for a report at some point in, just on what you're doing and how you're approaching it as we move forward with our work plan. Not to suggest that we would be fronting that effort, but that we have it on our schedule for discussion at some point. Director Busick, please.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And in keeping with the previous comments and the comments just made by Ms. Johnson, yeah, it's really, really important that we work with Ms. Johnson to determine the appropriate things that we're measuring in these KPIs and that the language is very accurate when it talks about what it is we're measuring. It's easy to say Ms. Johnson is GM CEO, she's responsible for everything. Well, no, come on, let's be realistic. Let's make it a realistic measure of the things that she can and should be responsible for. And working with her in that regard, I think, is critically important. So thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Kroll, do you have anything to add to this discussion before we move on to other matters?
Nope.
Thank you all. I think this was a good discussion. And again, it's a start. It's a first step. It's something in a longer term strategy, but we just wanted to keep the ball moving forward and to mix metaphors. But anyway, are there any other matters from this committee to discuss or other board members? Seeing none, the next performance committee meeting will meet on Monday, September 9th at 8:30 a.m. And our work plan is busy for September, so we very well may need to hold a second performance committee to make sure we get through all the items on our plate. In the meantime, I really would like to see the additional input on some of these KPIs and how we can better craft a document to reflect all of the input that we received today. As I just stated, the performance committee meeting next month is pretty busy. Items include reviewing the final results of the total compensation study that RKL mentioned and that they are conducting, making additional progress on the 360 tool, and then discussing the agency annual scorecard and having an update on the GM CEO annual goals. We have a lot to discuss, so we may ask the board office to poll for additional meeting times, not only directors, but GM CEO Johnson and Ms. Pelleggi as well. Are there any other items to bring before this committee? Seeing none, we will adjourn this meeting at 3:15 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you all.
Thank you.